Well, as Matt says, we're coming to the end today of our series, looking at people in the Bible who's had encounters with God and whose lives were utterly transformed by that experience that they had of God. Their lives were never the same again. Let's take a quick reminder of who some of those people were. We looked at Abraham, who in his old age encountered with God and discovered a life of learning how to journey by faith. We looked at Jacob, the twister, the wheeler dealer, who had an encounter with God that broke all that out of him and taught him how to learn how to live life depending on God. We've looked at Peter and his disastrous letting down and betrayal of Jesus, who discovered an encounter with God that let him know that God is a God who restores failures. We looked at Zacchaeus, that taxman and collaborator whose only God in life was money, whose encounter with Jesus led to him reversing his priorities. We looked at Paul, a former opponent and persecutor of Christianity, whose encounter with Jesus led to him experiencing utter transformation. To Elijah the prophet and his challenge and confrontation with the prophets of Baal, whose encounter for him and for them and for the nation led everyone to realize God's supremacy alone. We've looked at Joshua, who led God's people into the promised land and who wanted to know if God was on his side before he went in, and God met with him and said, the issue is not, am I on your side? The issue is, are you on my side? And his encounter led to him aligning correctly. We looked at the woman at the well, that outcast of her village who discovered that Jesus knew all about her and forgave her and gave her hope for the future. We looked at Joseph, who had a life of ups and downs and through it all discovered God's sovereignty. And then last week, Martin showed us Moses, who went up the mountain. He said to God, now show me your glory. And he experienced that nature of God, the Lord, the gracious and compassionate God. Now, after all of that, who would doubt that an encounter with the living God profoundly changes people? Yes? And there are some people here who've encountered God and whose lives are different now. Yes? 3 of you. Wonderful. But as we close this series, we want to end by reflecting on a really important issue. And that is that while an encounter with God will always change us, it won't always change our circumstances. At least not as quickly as we might hope. Actually, that was true of all that list of people that we looked at. They all had journeys to make, loads to carry, challenges to put through, time to bear with, waiting to be endured. They all had to learn that an encounter with God won't always change things, but I tell you what, it will always change us and help us to go through the things that life throws at us. And actually, nowhere is that seen more clearly in the Bible than in the character that we're ending with today. It's a guy called Job, who had such an important lesson to learn about knowing God's presence that he gets a whole Bible book devoted just to him and his story. Well, that story begins by outlining to us the life that he had. Let's read our first passage, which is the opening verses of Job. Now, in the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys and had a large number of servants. In other words, in the language of his time, he had a bob or two. And he was the greatest man among all the peoples of the East. Wow. What a guy there. He had absolutely everything. A successful, self-made man with a great family, a beautiful home, lots of money, all the health and wealth that you could wish for. And then in an instant, it all changes, just like it can in life sometimes. Secondly, the story goes on to tell us about the trouble that he experienced. We're going to read on in the story. One day, when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who's escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I'm the only one who's escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the eldest brother's house when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them and they're dead, and I'm the only one who's escaped to tell you. My goodness, they didn't just come singly, did they? There was a whole bunch of buses turning up at the same time. But at this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground in worship and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. And in all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. And if we read on into chapter 2, we'd find as if that wasn't enough, he then gets afflicted with some disease that covers his whole body with sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. And the sores are that bad that his friends turn up and they don't even recognize him. I mean, man, this is a total turnaround from the life that this guy had known. A turnaround so big, so painful, so depressing that by chapter 3, he's actually saying, oh God, why was I ever born? And all of this stuff leads him to ask a big one-word question. Why? Why, God? Anybody ever asked that? A few nods. Why? I've done everything right. I've lived a godly life. Things were going well. Why? Why, God? Why? Why do bad things happen to good people? Have you ever wondered that question? I have. Why? And the following 34 chapters are all about the exploring of that question. As the story moves on to our third point, the struggles that he went through. Struggles that 3 of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, are convinced they've got the answer for. An answer that would not only get him through what he was experiencing at the moment, that would actually get him out of what he was going through. The answer was quite simply, they were 100% convinced was, there must be secret sin in your life, Job. Funny, isn't it? Still some Christians come up with that answer. Or you've been prayed for and you've not been healed yet. Must be some sin in your life, sister. Trouble going on at work, there must be some secret sin, brother, that you need to root out. Trouble was, that just didn't ring true for Job. I mean, he knew he wasn't perfect. Who of us is? He knew he wasn't perfect, but he knew with all his heart he was seeking to live a godly life, as the introduction to the whole story makes clear. He knew he was trying to be a genuinely godly man, genuinely trying to please God. And that was why he couldn't work out why all this stuff happened. Why does such bad stuff happen to good people? And chapters 4 to 32 of Job are this conversation backwards and forwards between Job and his three friends, whereby in different words they say to him, well, it all comes down to God is righteous, and if this has happened, there must be sin. Classic Jewish thinking at the time. And Job wrestling with, I know that you're saying that, but... And then the other friend comes and dumps the same stuff on him, and he'll answer back for chapter after chapter after chapter, until we get to chapter 32, when there's a guy who has the answer, a young man, a young buck called Elihu. And this young man had the answer. Funny how some things never change in life, isn't it? He got the answer, he said, stand back, literally. He said, stand back, everyone. I've got this. And everyone's waiting with bated breath. And then all he does is churn out the same old answers that all the old guys have done. And poor old Job, through all of this, racked with physical and emotional and spiritual pain, keeps wrestling with this question. Yeah, I know, God, but why? Why? And here's the thing, it's only when he's utterly at the end of himself that he gets his breakthrough, that he has an encounter with God. So let's look, fourthly, at the encounter that he had. Out of the blue, after all this deep theological explanation of why this has gone on, none of which has rung true with him, out of the blue, Job has what we've looked at throughout this whole series. Job has his own personal encounter with God. And suddenly, everything turns round. But it turns round not because he finds answers, but because he finds God. Not because he finds answers, but because he finds God. Chapter 38, for 3 or 4 chapters, God breaks in to Job's life and Job's questions. He breaks in actually through a storm that arose, a terrifying storm, and God breaks in. And here's the funny thing. He doesn't give Job the answer to the question that he's been looking for. The answer to that question, why? He doesn't even address the issues that Job gets to later in his conversation about the justice and the righteousness of God. How can a just God, how can a righteous God let things like this happen to me? He doesn't answer any of Job's questions. He just does this terrifying experience of revealing himself to Job and says, do you know what I know? Let's just read a few of the verses that will give us a feel of what God says to him. Now, it's written in the pre-scientific language of Job's time. Job probably is dated around the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, people who measured their wealth in cattle and so on. So it's got that worldview at the time. So it's very poetic to us, but you'll get the picture. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, this far you may come and no further. Here is where your proud waves halt. Have you ever given orders to the morning? Or shown the dawn its place? That it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? The earth takes shape like clay under a seal. Its features stand out like those of a garment. The wicked are denied their light, and their upraised arm is broken. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all. Whoa, and it goes on for chapter after chapter as God goes on to challenge Job. Do you know about the weather? Do you know how the weather's formed? Do you know about the planets? Do you know all about the mysteries of animal life? Do you know the concepts of divine justice and glory and power? 4 chapters of God revealing what a great God he is and saying, do you know any of this? Do you understand any of this? Now, I don't know how long this encounter lasted. I suspect it lasted longer than it would take me to read it to you, which would just be a few minutes. But you know what? By the end of this encounter with God, Job is utterly overwhelmed by the presence of God. And suddenly, he doesn't need answers anymore. Why not? Because he has found that God himself is the answer. God himself is the answer. Let's look what he says after this revelation of God. Chapter 42, 1-6. Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand. Things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. Oh, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. God has moved from being real but remote to being real but very present with him in that situation. And what Job discovered that day was that the presence of God changes everything. You might not have answers to your questions yet. You might not be out of the situation you were in, but it's okay because God is there. And this encounter utterly changes Job. Now, we all face tough times at times, don't we? Even as Christians, yes. You know, where are my 3 people who answer my questions? Yeah, we all go through tough times, don't we? Becoming a Christian doesn't rob us of that stuff, of life in a fallen world. We're not exempt by being a Christian. And praying doesn't always change things instantly, does it? I mean, I don't understand how prayer works. There are some things where I've done almost a casual offhand at prayer and seen a miracle happen. And other things I prayed and fasted about for weeks, years, and nothing shifted yet. Do my 3 people agree with that? Yeah. Oh, we're growing. But you know what? Encountering God and knowing his presence, his grace, his love, his care, meeting him as what Martin told us about last week, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God. Slow to anger and abounding in love and mercy, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Encountering that God is what always takes us through. And we say, I don't need the answers now, Lord. I don't even need the change because I know that you are with me. You know, probably nobody in the Bible experienced more challenges, difficulties, opposition, outright persecution than the Apostle Paul. And would he have prayed to be rescued from all of that? You bet he did. We know that he did at times. But God chose to take Paul through things rather than to rescue him from them. Why? Because he was dealing with stuff in Paul on the way, just like he was dealing with stuff in Job. Of course, I missed out the bit of the story in Job, didn't I? Where, why did this story happen? Because the devil had come and said, can I test this guy to see whether his faith's as strong as everybody says it is? Stuff going on behind the scenes. So God didn't rescue Paul from things, but he did take him through things and gave him the grace. Here was the secret. Let's have that next slide, please. This was the secret that Paul learned. In order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. I love that in passing, by the way. Can you hear the indignation? I asked God 3 times about this. It was clearly used to getting his prayers answered first time, wasn't it? 3 times I pleaded with God to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. In him. That's why God lets us go through tough times sometimes to remind us that, we don't always have all the answers, all the energy, all the resources, all the ability to fix things, but rather to teach us and train us to push into him who does have all those things, who does have all the grace that Paul discovered to help us get through. because he is the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God. In 1972, I left my school teaching job to go to a theological seminary for 3 years to train to become a pastor, to get trained in theology. And I went through quite an experience while I was there. In the first month, I think it was, of being at the college, I was taking notes. Now, who remembers a thing called a pen and paper? What, yeah? Well, before phones and thumbs and fingers and laptops, there was a thing called pen and paper. And in the age of the dinosaurs, we used to have to write notes down. Here's the thing. You didn't even get note outlines. We give note outlines on School of Applied Theology. You didn't get anything. You just had to listen, and you had to write furiously. And some of our lecturers, went really fast. My lecturer in Old Testament theology, Arthur Cundall, bless him, with the Lord now. I forgive you, Arthur. You had to write furiously. And you were trying to listen, and you're writing down. And in one lecture, I remember, it was about a month in, I'm writing furiously, and all of a sudden, this is not a medical explanation, this is what I felt. Something snapped in my neck. I felt something like it went in my neck, and pain shot down my arm. I couldn't hold my pen any longer. And that was the beginning of 3 years of deep trouble with my back, my neck. I often couldn't sit down in lectures. Lecturers knew I often used to have to stand at the back of the class and, maybe come and then write some things down as best I could. For 3 years, I lived with that, having given my life to God to go to Bible college. And this is what I get. Thank you very much. Well, why did it take 3 years? Well, I better tell you how it ended, hadn't I? Now, obviously, over that time, I went to see doctors, I went to see physiotherapists, I went to see chiropractors. Any healing meeting within 50 miles I went to, went forward for prayer, not a thing changed. I prayed, I fasted, I bound every demon you could think of. I think I invented demons, you demon of neck binding, I loose you in. I did everything. And not a thing changed for 3 years. Until I got right to the end of my course. And when I got to the end of my course, one day I woke up and it had gone. And it's never come back since. And I don't want it to come back either. Why wait 3 years? Why let me live through that for 3 years? Well, you see, when I went to Bible college, I was a bit like Elihu. I was the young man who knew everything. In fact, I was surprised I went to Bible college, actually, because And little by little, God is peeling off the layers and saying to me, it's not about you, Mike. You don't know anything. Without me, you wouldn't be here even. And it was during that time that I discovered again that verse of Paul. 3 times I beseeched the Lord about this. But God said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. You see, what I learned was that God did not want Mike Beaumont doing ministry in Mike Beaumont's character and ability and gifting and strength. He wanted me doing it in his ability. Amen? And I was such a tough character, it took 3 years. Learn quickly is my advice out of that one. Do you know what? Some of you have walked and are walking through really tough times. And it's not by accident that we're ending this series with Job. Martin and I chose to end the series with Job, because we want it to underline encounters with God are true and real and powerful and change you, but they don't always change things. Sometimes you have to walk through them because God is doing stuff in you and through you and around you, through all of that. Some of you are going through stuff. Some of you are walking with stuff. Maybe you've been doing that for a long time. Well, do you know what? Today, we, the leaders, we want to invite you today to sort of press into God again, the God who says, my grace is sufficient for you, like Job found. And I'm going to pray for people in a moment, but I want to make clear, I am not praying with expectation that your situation, your health, your family, your money will necessarily change. It may, it depends on God. But what I do have faith for is praying that today some of us can encounter God just in the quietness and say, God, this is tough, this is hard. But I want to meet with you, the God whose grace is sufficient and who can take me through.